Iago has so much to say and is such a dominant force in the world of Othello that it's tempting to say that the play should be titled Iago instead. But that's wrong. The play is called Othello because it is his tragedy. As much as we may be drawn to or attracted to Iago, at least until he crosses the line, that is, and as much as he may be the dominant force in the play, no one ever thinks of Iago's end as being tragic. In fact, we probably want far more to happen to him. The tragedy is Othello's. We are meant to feel horror and pity in response to him murdering Desdemona and then his subsequent decision to end it all when he realizes the full horror of what he has done and how he has been deceived and used. The fall of someone who genuinely loved and was genuinely great, but who succumbed to his own weakness, his own flawed humanity, is a tragic end in and of itself. However, in Othello's case, there is also an added sense of tragedy and dis-ease because a malevolent force toys with him, plots his downfall, and manipulates him into his own destruction. And that brings us to Iago, because Iago is that malevolent force, or at least the agent of that malevolent force. And here's our topic for today's video. Let's start off by examining who exactly Iago is in Othello. On a basic level, we know Iago as a soldier. He is Othello's ensign or flag bearer. Being the ensign was an important and honourable position because of the way that a unit's flag or colours were symbolic of the unit's identity, pride, and honour. If the colours were lost, the entire unit would be in a state of complete disgrace. This suggests to us that Iago is well known for being an excellent soldier because you do not entrust the flag to just anyone. And it also suggests to us that he is somebody who is to be trusted. Of course, that is not suggested to us for the rest of the play because Shakespeare does everything he can to point out that everyone, and I mean everyone, thinks that Iago is trustworthy. Apart from that, if we believe Iago, and on this, we don't have much reason to disbelieve him, as untruthful as Iago is, but if we believe Iago, he has fought many battles with Othello, both close to home and far afield. If this is true, then the 28-year-old Iago is an experienced soldier who has proved himself over time, which led to him becoming the ensign and a trusted confidant of Othello. His reputation then is excellent, and it seems to be deserved, at least on the surface. Other than that, while his social position is not clear, he seems to be high enough by virtue of his position and reputation, which he uses rather well, to rub shoulders with the elite without being a part of them. Now, I am speculating here, but this might also be part of the reason why Othello trusts him. Othello is both an insider and an outsider. As the general of the Venetian army, Othello is very much an insider. He is in with the soldiers, and he is a trusted and respected member of Venetian society. But he is also an outsider because he is a Moor, because he doesn't come from Venice, and because he is a soldier, which automatically places him outside the realm of the civilian. And so Othello is trapped in the situation in which he is both an insider and an outsider. And I would suggest there's an element of similarity between Othello and Iago. Iago is a Venetian. He's not highborn, but he is a Venetian, and so he is very much part of that society. But he is also a soldier like Othello, and he is not of the upper classes. And so he is very much an outsider in that sense as well. And so perhaps that is part of why Othello trusts Iago so much. Obviously, there's his reputation and everything else, but there's this similarity between the two of them. And of course, there's the obvious fact that they fought together on numerous occasions, and Iago has been a successful, as far as we know, ensign. And so he has no real reason to distrust Iago. Anyway, let's back up a minute. If we put this together, we get a picture of Iago as being somebody who has a decent place in society with an excellent reputation. He seems to have some ambition, since he wants to be promoted to the position of lieutenant, and according to himself, when he speaks to Rodrigo at the beginning of the play, he has petitioned some of the Magnificos in Venice to try and convince Othello to make Iago the new lieutenant. Of course, it goes to Cassio instead. But having said that, his ambition is hardly the kind of sort of vaulting ambition that you see in Macbeth. And other than the initial irritation that we see him expressed at being overlooked, irritation is not the right word, anger and rage and hatred seem to be better, but apart from that initial reaction to being overlooked, he actually doesn't seem particularly interested in gaining the position itself. We'll look at that later, but it's striking that Iago doesn't celebrate becoming lieutenant. He's more interested in Cassio and Othello's downfall than anything else. So that would suggest that he doesn't have this great driving ambition, even though there seems to be a bit of ambition there. There's a lot more we could dig into there, but Iago's motivation doesn't seem to be for wealth or status. And that's interesting, because we have to question what actually drives Iago. The truth is, he doesn't seem particularly interested in gaining anything. Setting that aside for now, we can see that Iago is also very intelligent. I've heard some people complain that Iago couldn't possibly be regarded as being a genius or extremely intelligent because A, he gets found out in court, and B, because he just seems to react to situations that arise and takes advantage of them rather than orchestrating everything from scratch. But I would disagree with that. There does seem to be an element of genius in the way that he twists and manipulates situations to his benefit. Iago has an uncanny ability to be able to form a broad or a general plan, set it in motion, and then adapt very quickly to the events that arise to maximize the effectiveness of his plan or to adapt to new scenarios. And also, a lot of the time, he puts himself in the position where he can use whatever comes up his way to his advantage. There is a kind of genius in that. And while it is true that he is fortunate that things seem to fall into his lap and that things go well fortuitously for him, that's not to say that he doesn't also exhibit a great deal of intelligence at the same time. Now, that intelligence may be used in the wrong direction, but it still shows intelligence. For example, he very clearly orchestrates Othello's suspicions towards Cassio. And it's maybe straightforward, and we can criticize Othello for not investigating himself, but the way that he uses Cassio's positive attributes against him to orchestrate the suspicions against him is masterful indeed. He knows that Cassio is highborn, that Cassio is good-looking, that Cassio has courtly manners and is young and has everything that seems to make him a match with Desdemona. And he also knows that Cassio is weak when it comes to alcohol. And so he gets Cassio drunk and he manipulates Rodrigo into spurring Cassio into beating him up. And then, yes, Cassio attacks one of the other characters, which Iago could not have planned. But he created the entire situation that made that event a possibility. And from there, he pushes Cassio to go to Desdemona and use Desdemona to try and get his position back, which is good advice, normally, if you don't have an Iago around to manipulate that situation. But then he goes and he just ensures that he's in the spot where he can say to Othello, I like not that. And then he goes about manipulating the conversation and being very careful with what he says and what he doesn't say and how he says it to cause Othello's suspicions to arise and multiply. All of that is Iago's doing. Yes, one or two things go his way and unforeseen events really help him out, but those things, like Othello dropping the handkerchief, don't make a difference if Iago hasn't already laid the groundwork. And so I would argue that there's a great deal of intelligence that we see in Iago. He is adaptable, reacts quickly, he's able to play with people at will. He's very intelligent, and yet it all does come undone at the end. And there is supposed to be a message in that. I think, though, beyond his intelligence, Iago is also charming. This is a bit more subjective, I know, but he is funny. He is undeniably funny. He doesn't have some sort of demonic presence that just puts people off. People seem to like him. Even people who he treats quite poorly, like Emilia. She likes him, and yes, you could say that she's blinded by love or whatever, but it can't just be that. There's got to be a reason that everybody else seems to like him and get on with him. And that can't just be Iago playing a role. I mean, we know he's concealing a deep darkness within, but at the same time, he seems to be naturally charming. And he has to be, because if he is representative of the face of evil, then he absolutely needs to be charming, because no one is taken in by blatant, open, malevolent evil. And that seems to be an element of evil. Part of what this play does, as I've said in the past, is study evil and the nature of evil. And this seems very much to me to be one of those elements of evil, in that it is concealed and covered up by other good attributes or by other things that make you attractive. And I think that's part of the reason why Iago, at least at the beginning, is, and most of the way through, is actually quite an attractive character to the audience. Yes, some people don't get attracted to him, but he is a charismatic character, not only for the other characters on stage, but also for the audience. We are supposed to be attracted to Iago, and part of that comes from his charisma and his humor. If you're looking for examples of his humor, I would direct you to the interaction that he has with Rodrigo at the end of Act 1 and Scene 3. In it, Rodrigo considers death to be the only adequate response to Desdemona's marriage to Othello. It's terribly funny, but it's also the epitome of evil, since he actively encourages poor old Roddy to believe the worst of Desdemona, but still pursue her and commit adultery, all the while planning to take him for every ounce of gold and silver he possesses. And he seems to enjoy it. Again, this is the nature of evil on display. Having said that, there's also a humorous, roguish charm about Iago when he straight up tells Rodrigo that he cannot be trusted because he serves his own ends, and then in doing so, gets Rodrigo to trust him. Actually, I think it's probably worth reading it. This comes from Act 1, Scene 1, and lines 41 to 55. "O sir, content you. I follow him to serve my turn upon him. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. You shall mark many a duteous and knee-crooking knave that, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wears out his time much like his master's ass, for naught but provender, and when he is old, cashiered. With me such honest knaves. Others there are, who, trimmed in forms and visages of duty, keep yet their hearts attending on themselves, and throwing but shows of service to their lords, do well thrive by them. And when they have lined their coats, do themselves homage. These fellows have some soul, and such a one do I profess myself." It's hilariously funny. And that line, "these fellows have some soul, and such a one do I profess myself," is desperately funny when we realize what Iago is actually doing there. He is saying the quiet part out loud. He is telling Rodrigo that he cannot be trusted. He's basically telling him everything he does is served to, or is to serve his own ends. And Rodrigo hears none of it. He just hears, oh, he's not on Othello's side. Iago there can tell the absolute truth about himself not being trustworthy to make Rodrigo trust him. It's very funny, it's very clever, and the way that he uses the language, the way that he is so creative and so and expresses himself so vibrantly makes him likable. So, who is Iago? He's a soldier of middling social standing. He has an excellent reputation. He is charming, intelligent, funny, witty. He is known to everyone as Honest Iago, and he is evil to the core, which is something we'll get to a little bit later on. And, as we have just seen, he tells us that he is only after things that are going to benefit himself. That's something I want you to put in the back of your mind and consider as we look at the rest of Iago's character. Does he really serve his own ends? The second thing I want us to consider is the idea that Iago is honest. Everyone who knows anything about Othello knows that to the other characters in the play, Iago is known for his exceeding honesty. And that this is a wonderful example of dramatic irony because he is as false as water. And so it's very easy to pigeon Iago simply as a liar. And this is true. Iago is a liar. But I've already alluded to something that's quite interesting. Iago often speaks the truth, the unpleasant truth, but in a way that gets people to do what he wants. Iago is full of lies, but it's how he takes the truth and uses the truth for his own ends that is truly devious. He tells true lies, and it's quite masterful to watch him do that. We've just seen an example of him doing that. The previous passage I read, we can see Iago telling the truth about himself, but thanks to a mixture of the way that he deploys it and frames it, and to the way that Rodrigo interprets it, he's able to use the truth to be honest and misdirect people. But if we were to stand back and consider things soberly, we could almost say that Rodrigo should not have been as easily mistaken as he was, because Iago told him exactly what he was. In that same scene, Iago tells Rodrigo, "I am not what I am." And this is an obvious inversion of how God introduces himself to be Moses. And so the association with Iago as being honest when he is not, and his insistence that he is honest, clearly positions him as being in the camp of the devil, who is a liar and the father of lies. It's that inversion and his lies that mark him out as being a force for evil. And this is something that the reader is supposed to pick up, or that a member of the audience is supposed to pick up when he hears Iago use that sort of language. It's not done by accident. Now, let's get into Iago's relationship with the truth. It's interesting. I'm not going to provide examples of how he blatantly lies and tells the opposite of the truth. Those examples are easy to find. You can quite easily go and do it yourself. Rather, what I want to focus on is how Iago, as I've already indicated, is how Iago uses the truth to lie and strengthen his lies. He uses truth and his reputation as a weapon. Actually, I would go so far as to say that Iago's relationship with language is closer to the postmodernist's assertion that speech is a power game in which you try and use language to get power over others. So what I'd like to do in considering this is to have a look at some examples of how he uses language and how he uses the truth and how he uses half-truths and hints at things without saying them outright to manipulate people into believing what he wants them to believe. I'm going to go back to that first speech we read. I'm going to read it again, but I'm going to take it to the end so we can highlight a few things. "O sir, content you," he says. "I follow him to serve my turn upon him." Absolute truth. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. And this, again, is true. Not everybody is a leader. Not everybody is in a position of authority. And not all leaders have loyal followers. "You shall mark," he says, "many a duteous and knee-crooking knave that, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wears out his time, much like his master's ass, for naught but provender, and when he is old, cashiered." Again, this is true. We all know people who have been absolutely faithful to the company, to their master, to their boss, whoever it might be, to a client, and basically when they're used up, they're discarded, they're cashiered. How many times, for example, have you heard people say, don't put the company or the business that you work for first because it's going to carry on when you're gone? They don't really care about you. They're not going to be there for you when you're sick, when you're retired, when things go badly wrong. It's your friends and family who will be there. And you probably know somebody who's been terribly treated or terribly taken advantage of by some sort of overlord. It's true. So far, Iago said nothing but the truth. He says, whip me such honest knaves. Others there are who trimmed in forms and visages of duty, yet keep their hearts attending on themselves and throwing but shows of service on their lords, do well thrive by them, and when they have lined their coats, do themselves homage. These fellows have some soul, and such a one do I profess myself. Again, there is truth to this, but this is where he starts to twist things a little bit. It is certainly true. It's a true observation that there are lots of people who pretend to be loyal and honest and faithful to the cause, but in reality are just lining their own pockets. That is true. But then Iago goes on to say that's who he is, and that's the correct way to go about life, self-serving. And that's up for discussion, and that's up for debate. I tend to think that that is the wrong conclusion, but it takes Rodrigo in a particular direction. Now, the way that he is very honest about who he is misleading to Rodrigo, because he knows that what's up for discussion here is whether or not he's faithful to Othello. Rodrigo suspects that Iago is faithful to Othello over himself, and Iago is trying to convince him otherwise, because ultimately Iago wants Rodrigo to keep giving him money. And so he tells the truth here because that's quite convincing, and he's obviously quite impassioned about it, and he makes some true observations, and he's already shown Rodrigo that he has been wronged by Othello, and all of this is quite convincing because he tells the truth to mislead him away from the idea that he's actually not loyal to Rodrigo. And if Rodrigo was smarter, and if he was more switched on, this would have been something that he could come back to and think, maybe I'm trusting the wrong person. Maybe I'm trusting the wrong person here, because he's just told me that he's interested in nothing but himself. For, sir, it is as sure as you are Rodrigo, were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. In following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I for love and duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart in complement extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for doors to pick at. I am not what I am. In summary, Iago tells the truth about himself to make another point or to convince his victim about something else. We know that a good lie mixes truth with falsehoods, and so he invites Rodrigo in by telling the truth, but he's playing him. And that's what's so interesting, is that actually the majority of what Iago says here is true, and he's being very open and very honest about who he is. But he does that because he knows it's going to foster trust, and he does that because he is able to frame it in such a way that makes Rodrigo think that he's on his side, because he's already said that he dislikes Othello immensely and that Othello has wronged him. It's very clever, it's very manipulative. What he's doing here is using the truth as a weapon, as a tool. And so we can't simply say that Iago is just a liar. He's not just a liar. He takes the truth and he manipulates it and he uses it, as I said, as a tool. And if you want to draw some parallel, which I think we should, because it's in Shakespeare's mind here, what seems to me that it's in Shakespeare's mind here, if you were to go to the Gospels, you will see that Jesus has an interaction with the devil, and the devil takes actual words of Scripture, the words of God, and he uses those to try and direct Jesus away from his task to serving Satan himself. Jesus, of course, doesn't take the bait. That's what Iago's doing here. He's using words of truth to try and manipulate and get his victim on his side, which is the side of evil. And Rodrigo does take the bait, and it destroys him. And that's one of the ideas we're supposed to get here about how evil operates. Let's have a look at another passage. Act 2, Scene 3, lines 205 to 233. The context of this is Cassio's drunken brawl. Othello is mad. Effectively, his wedding night has just been interrupted, and he wants to know what's going on. Iago doesn't want to talk, or makes a show of not wanting to talk, because he wants to make it appear that he doesn't want to say anything bad about Cassio, when actually that's all that he wants to do. Anyway, things happen. He's convinced to talk. "Touch me not so near," says Iago. "I had rather have this tongue cut out from my mouth than it should do offense to Michael Cassio." So that's a blatant falsehood, but it's what people think he believes. So he's telling them what they already think is true, because it positions him as somebody who is a sympathetic witness to Cassio's misdeed. And by framing the entire conversation in this light, by lying about his attitude towards Cassio, he would very much like to say very nasty things about Cassio to get him destroyed. But in framing it that he doesn't want to, he can tell the truth or part of the truth and make it seem like he's protecting Cassio rather than protecting himself and fighting Cassio. Deeply manipulative, very intelligent. Yet I persuade myself to speak the truth shall nothing wrong him. Which is actually true. If he told the whole truth, they'd be coming after Iago, not on Cassio. But he's not going to tell the whole truth. He's going to be selective with it. Thus it is, General. Montano and myself, being in speech, there comes Othello crying out for help, and Cassio following him with a determined sword to execute upon him. Sir, this gentleman, that is Montano, steps in to Cassio and entreats his pause. Myself, the crying fellow, did pursue, lest by his clamour, as it so fell out, the town might fall in fright. He, sir, swift of foot, outran my purpose, and I returned the rather for that I heard the clink and fall of swords. And Cassio high an oath, which till tonight I never might say before. When I came back, for this was brief, I found them close together at blow and thrust, even as again they were when you yourself did part them. More of this matter I cannot part. So Iago provides just the bare facts of the immediate incident. He doesn't provide the truth that he knows outside. He leaves out the fact that he knows Rodrigo, and he keeps it to the bare fact, but he weaves in a little bit of commentary. So what are the bare facts he uses? Well, he says he's talking to Montano. There's a cry for help. In comes Cassio, determined to strike down this unknown stranger. There's a lie. He knows exactly who it is. The rest is true. And Montano steps in to try and calm Cassio down. Iago chases after the intruder. He escapes, which is not true. They have a conversation, and Iago lets Rodrigo disappear into the night. And then he says he hears the clink and fall of swords. He comes back in, and here's the editorializing. He says that he would never have dreamed that Cassio could ever do such a thing. He would never consider the possibility of Cassio losing his temper like this. Of course, that's precisely the point. We know that he did consider that, and he manipulated the situation so that Cassio would become the angry drunkard that he knows that he is. In any case, he records the facts but leaves out the framing and takes his own role in it out completely. So there's a mixture of truth and lies again, but he's controlling the narrative. Again, he's using language as a tool and as a weapon to control everyone by using the correct amount of truth and falsehood. He says what is true that nobody could accuse him of telling a lie, but he also holds back a little bit. He seems to be glossing over Cassio's misdeed here. He doesn't say that he wounded Montano terribly. He just says that he was in a state of anger, and such that he couldn't imagine Cassio being in previously, but all of this is to gloss things over slightly. And then he goes on to try and make excuses for Cassio. He says, more of this matter I cannot report, but men are men, the best sometimes forget. Though Cassio did some little wrong to him, as men in rage strike those that wish them best, yet surely Cassio, I believe, received from him that fled some strange indignity, which patience could not pass. Iago pretending to put his own gloss, his own interpretation or editorial comment on the situation, makes him seem sympathetic to Cassio's cause, and is going to make everybody think, and does make everybody think, that he is downplaying what Cassio has done. And that's exactly how Othello takes it. He goes on, Othello responds, I know, Iago, thy honesty and love doth mince this matter, making it light to Cassio. Cassio, I love thee, but never more be officer of mine. And he sacks him. Iago's framing and his words and his mannerisms and the way that he says everything successfully manipulates Othello into thinking the situation is far worse than what Iago has reported. In reality, what Iago has reported is actually quite accurate. Yes, Cassio was drunk. Yes, he was angry and he had a fight with Rodrigo, a civilian. And yes, he strikes at Montano. That's it. But the way that he frames it makes it seem like it's drastically worse. Look, it's bad, but it makes it seem like it's worse. And he knows that he knows exactly what he's doing. again, that this is Iago keeping back some of the truth, telling other aspects of the truth, but doing in such a way that it gives off the desired impression to manipulate the others into thinking worse of Cassio. Post-recording me here, I neglected to say in my initial recording that one of the big things Iago does here is make it seem as though he is trying to make excuses for Cassio when in reality there are none. The fact that he says there must have been some sort of insult and so on that caused him to do this, which is, as we know, true, is also the kind of excuse that a friend makes for the other friend when you're trying to get him or her off the hook. And that's precisely how everybody interprets it, because from their standpoint, there are no mitigating factors. There's no excuse for what Cassio has done, particularly if you are Montano, who's just been wounded and who is angry with Rodrigo, with Cassio. And with regard to Othello, as far as he's concerned, there is no excuse for a soldier failing to do his duty and failing to obey orders and creating some sort of disorder and attacking a civilian. Iago knows all of this. And so it's almost as though if he had not made the excuse for Cassio at all, it would have been better for Cassio. But by trying to make the excuse, it automatically means that other people are going to view his testimony as being unduly favorable towards Cassio. And so they discount the mitigating factors that he presents to them. It's very clever. Now, there are so many other passages we could draw from, but we also don't have unlimited time here. But I will just refer you to a few other examples of Iago using and manipulating the truth to control other people. There's his response to Cassio's heartbroken reputation. I have lost my reputation in the same scene. Iago correctly responds by saying, oh, look, reputation's often undeserved. It's often unfairly lost, and it's often unfairly or unjustly gained. This is absolutely true. We all know that this is true. We've all met people who have gained or lost reputation unfairly. We've all met people who've experienced this. And so that is true. But he then goes on to say that, look, reputation really doesn't matter. So what he does is he presents the true facts, but then he deliberately chooses a conclusion that he knows is false. But it's also not one that's completely unbelievable. Many people fall into the trap of saying, look, I don't care what people think of me. Who cares? Well, it makes a difference. And Iago knows that, because he would not be able to do what he was doing if he didn't have that reputation, unfair as it is, for being honest. Although perhaps it's not as unfair as we give it credit, because he is rather honest. He is speaking a lot of truth here. He's just mixing that truth with lie, and he's framing it in a particular way, and he's using the truth as a tool. Iago trades on reputation. He knows it's false. We could also consider his famous line to Othello about jealousy. Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on. Absolutely true. And nobody knows it more than Iago firsthand, because he's consumed by envy and jealousy. And yet he does that. He drops that truth in the perfect spot to inflame Othello's jealousy and rage. He uses it as a tool to manipulate the feelings and beliefs of others. And he is very good at doing it. He is totally unconstrained by the confines of the truth. The truth for him is not an end. It's not a cardinal virtue. It's just a tool that he plays with and uses. He doesn't care for the truth at all. And he doesn't view language as a vessel for communicating the truth. And a person like that is very dangerous indeed. The fact that Iago is totally unconstrained by the truth and just uses it as a tool is what makes him dangerous to the characters in the play. Truth is a cardinal virtue, and we tend to assume that the people speaking to us are largely telling the truth. Look, we know that people lie, but we tend to assume that what somebody tells us is the truth. That makes us vulnerable to people who don't use it or who have deceived themselves. Because here's the thing. I mean, it doesn't come up that much in the play, but we can deceive ourselves as well. Everybody does. If you buy into your lies to yourself, you can tell a great deal of falsehood very convincingly indeed. And I think that Shakespeare shows the problem with having people doing that rather well. Not only does it cause chaos for everyone around Iago, that is, for society, it also isn't a viable way to keep on living, because eventually your lies do come out. And that is something that Shakespeare does show here. Iago gets caught at the end for a reason. And this is not a superstition, by the way. The reason lies have to come out at the end, if you're consistently lying. Look, the odd lie here or there is not going to come out. A white lie to your friend might never come out. A whole series of white lies that you told to your friend might never come out. But if you are consistently lying about a whole bunch of stuff, it is just going to come out. That's the way the world works. And it works that way because eventually your lies or your disingenuous framing of the truth runs into a reality problem, and the body of your speech no longer coheres with reality, and as a result of that, people figure out what's going on. And that's pretty much what happens to Iago at the end. Eventually, what he says is no longer plausible. Lies trade on plausibility. Eventually, it's just not plausible anymore, and it then comes back to bite him. And so in Iago's lies and in the way that he uses and manipulates the truth, we have some warnings. The first that we are supposed to take, I think, is that there are people like Iago, and we need to be careful of them and on the lookout for them. Look, you can't mistrust everyone, because society operates by trust, which is why lies are so destructive to it and why we're also so susceptible to it. But we do need to be on the lookout for people like them, or at least be aware that people who use and manipulate the truth in a demented way are very much in existence. And I know it's difficult to do this because we tend to assume people are telling the truth, but if you're at least aware of it or on the lookout for it, you can spot it. I think built into the text, there's a very good example of this. Everyone sees through the misdirects of the Turkish fleet. You know, if you go back to the beginning of the play, there's the war room council meeting in the dead of night, and all of these conflicting reports coming in, and the Turkish fleet tries to make it look like they're going for Rhodes rather than Cyprus, and immediately they dismiss it out of hand. They say that makes no sense. They're not. Their interest isn't Rhodes. Their interest is Cyprus. This is an obvious misdirect. And then new information comes out to say, yeah, the part of the fleet that broke off to go to Rhodes has rejoined the other fleet. And they're like, yeah, you see. They see through it immediately because they are aware that one of the core features of warfare is trying to trick your enemy, and feints and trickery. It's all part of the game. They know that, they're aware of it, they're looking for it, so they spot it. But in civil society, it's not supposed to be like that. And if you're not aware that you need to be looking out for it, it's very easy to be deceived. And so Iago remains undetected for so long because nobody's looking for lies in Iago. No one stops to think, maybe Iago's not telling the truth here, or maybe he's leading me down the wrong path, or maybe he's deliberately trying to manipulate or use me. They don't look for that there because they don't expect it to be there, and that makes them vulnerable, all of them. And so it's a message for us. Just you hold those two aspects of the play together, it's very clear. It's very clever by Shakespeare as well. You know, very often people say, look, the Turkish threat was just a plot device to take people away, or to the island so they get them out of Venice. And that's certainly true. It definitely is a plot device. I also think that there's a very good message there that often the greatest danger exists within the group. You know, the Turks don't end up being the big threat there. Iago ends up being the threat, somebody close to them and inside the group. So there's that. But I also think that you hold those two ideas up and we see very much the difference, or we see very much how we should be on the lookout for lies and falsehoods. So that's the first warning I think Shakespeare gives us there. I think the second warning would be this, that living like that, living a totally deceptive life causes harm to the people around you, but it also eventually comes back to bite you. So don't live like that yourself. Don't let your life be characterized by lies or by deception and manipulation. As an aside, I can't help but think that Shakespeare got burned by somebody whom he trusted, but later turned out to have been seriously untrustworthy and seriously betrayed him. There's something larger than life about Iago that suggests to me that this is coming from Shakespeare's very personal experience. Anyway, I can't link that to anything specific, but it does seem to me to be like that. all of this brings me to the last aspect of Iago that I think we need to examine, and that is his relationship with evil. And that's because to study Iago is to study evil itself. I don't mean to suggest that Iago is the incarnation of evil or the devil himself, though some literary critics, do suggest that about Iago based on his declaration, "I am not what I am," the inversion of God's words to Moses. Now, as I've mentioned, those words of Iago are certainly telling, and I do think they firmly put him on the side of evil, but I think saying that it marks him off as like the devil himself is going a bit too far. And I say that because, look, in Macbeth, Shakespeare presents us with a flawed character who faces temptation, vacillates between his two options, and then succumbs to that temptation and chooses the path of evil. And in choosing that path of evil, and succumbing to temptation, he is devastated and becomes more and more of a tyrant, more and more evil. But he knows that he has gone wrong and he despairs at his state. He's racked with guilt. He realizes that he's destroyed himself, but he feels trapped and cannot see any way out of it. And as a result, he doubles down and decides to see out his fate. And we see that in Macbeth, we have the human weakness and the human proclivity to succumb to temptation. But we also have supernatural evil agents who have a very big hand to play in the direction that Macbeth takes. But this is not the case with Iago. In Iago, there's no supernatural tempting force. There's no visible force of evil that's trying to take him away from the path of the good. And Iago, unlike Macbeth, does not struggle and despair against evil. There's no temptation, there's no choice. He just embraces it and even seems to take delight in it. There's a particular sense of playfulness or enjoyment, as well as perhaps some desperation in Iago at the end of Act 5 and Scene 1, when he exclaims as he's leaving the stage full of energy, "This is the night that either makes me or fordoes me quite." And what about Iago when he says, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse," in Act 1 and Scene 3, when he pulls the wool over Rodrigo's eyes and convinces him to continue pursuing Desdemona by attempting to buy her affections? No, in Iago, there's a wholehearted embrace of the path of evil. And there's an roguish enjoyment of the game that he seems to be playing. There's no concern for right and wrong whatsoever. In essence, then, I think Macbeth's character is the study of a person giving in to temptation and taking the path of evil and being tortured for doing so, whereas Iago is the study of someone who has so embraced evil that there's not a shred of remorse in him. I would go so far as to say that in Iago, you see the end state of somebody who has chosen and committed his path to evil, and in doing so has effectively become possessed and synonymous with evil itself. I've said elsewhere that I think Othello is a play about evil. Now, obviously, it's about more than that, but I think that in Shakespeare's great tragedies, one of the primary things that he seems to be dealing with or exploring is the nature of evil. And he does this masterfully. And I'll say now, before continuing, that Iago can be taken as a sort of cautionary tale. First, here's what happens when you start down a particular path and do not turn back. And you don't want to end there. And second, he's a warning that there are people out there like Iago. You need to be aware of this to have a chance at spotting people like this before it's too late, because there are people like that. Now, in considering Iago and his relationship with evil, one of the key things we need to look at is why he does what he does. This is also a question that people have asked over the centuries. What drives Iago? Why does he do what he does? But if you don't connect it to the theme of evil, then I think something vitally important is missing or is left out. So let's look at that question. Why does Iago do it? And I think it's a bit more complicated than you might think. We're dealing with motive, his rationale for doing what he does, and that needs to be split into two separate things. Firstly, ultimately, what is he trying to achieve? Ultimately, what is he aiming his life at? And second, what, if any, are his motives in the short term? You'll see why I make this distinction in a moment, but first, let's look at the reasons that Iago gives for what he does. His hatred of Othello, he says, is based on two things. Firstly, to Rodrigo, he says that he hates Othello because Othello did not give him the promotion he wanted and promoted Cassio instead. Now, this might indicate that he feels let down or betrayed by Othello, someone he previously loved, and this is the conclusion that Ewan McGregor took when he played Iago in his 2007 depiction of him. And it's plausible that actually Iago cared greatly for Othello and loved him a great deal and feels terribly betrayed. That is plausible, but I'm not so certain that's all there is to it. It can be that and other things, but Iago's response to all of this stuff seems to be based largely on envy. I mean, if you think about the scorn that he pours on Cassio and the way that he responds to Cassio's promotion with a sort of malevolent rage, it doesn't seem to be that all he's concerned about is the fact that he's being betrayed. I mean, it's more that Cassio's getting something that he himself can't get. I think it's very complex. He does say that to Rodrigo. Secondly, later to the audience, he says that he hates Othello because he says there is a rumor that Othello has slept with his wife, Emilia. Now, we need to be careful here. We do not know if there's a real rumor of this going around. It's just that Iago says there is one, and it certainly seems to be one that he has also shared with his wife, because she mentions it later on in the play. This would then be the jealousy that Iago warns Othello against. And I do find it compelling that Iago buys into the suspicion in the same way that Othello does. And so when he says, "Beware, my lord of jealousy," he knows what he's talking about from first-hand experience. These are the reasons he gives for hating Othello and trying to destroy him. Now, I don't want to get into this too much. Some people will say that it's actually all based on racism. That doesn't seem to sit right with me. He does use racial slurs against Othello, and he directs them against Othello. But that seems to come from a position of malevolence rather than being the reason he dislikes Othello so much. He only ever seems to bring Othello's race into it when he wants to insult him. So that suggests to me that it's not Othello's race that is the cause. He just uses it as a weapon to insult him. What about his destructive acts against Desdemona? Why does he do that? Well, he gives us no reason other than she's the available tool to get at Othello. Now, that does make some sense. She really is the best way to get to Othello, but there seems to be something else going on here. I say that because he claims that he is a bit in love with her in Act 2, Scene 1, in lines 280 to 282. But he then says he wants to turn her virtue into pitch and trap everybody up in the net that he is creating. And he urges Othello to kill her. This seems to indicate that there is at least an element of Iago basically saying something like, well, if I can't have her, no one can. In the same way that if he can't be lieutenant, then no one's going to be lieutenant. So that would be the depths of envy. But I think there's also more to it as well. He takes the most virtuous character in the play and he uses that virtue to entrap other people, that without showing any dismay or remorse at what happens to her. So he doesn't really care about her as an end or anything like that. He seems to take a fiendish delight in marring her reputation, destroying her who is good, and destroying the relationship that is good between Othello and Desdemona. And that is an aspect of evil. It seems to me that there's a particular fiendish delight that evil takes in marring and destroying that which is good. I'm going to draw a parallel here to the biblical narrative, because in the biblical narrative, it's very much suggested that the operation of Satan or the devil is to try and twist and destroy that which is good. And we see that replicated in Shakespeare's play, Othello. And that's when you cross over from simply something being immoral or something being wrong to evil. Now, there are modern philosophers who dispute the utility or the value or the legitimacy of the concept of evil itself. They say that it's not useful as a term, that it doesn't actually describe anything. But I would suggest that this is wrong, because there's a depth of depravity that takes delight in destroying or marring or ruining the good, the pure, the beautiful, the innocent. that goes beyond just being wrong or illegal or immoral. There's a depth and a demented enjoyment of desecration that seems to be a core facet of the concept of evil. And that's what we see a glimpse of in Iago. Why does he turn to Desdemona? Yes, she's a useful tool, and she's a tool that he can use to get at Othello. But she's so virtuous that even Iago is a bit in love with her, and yet he turns what is good and he twists it and manipulates it, turns it into pitch, and uses it against the other characters, and uses it for destructive, malevolent ends. That seems to be the core, or one of the cores of what evil is, or one of the cores of the nature of evil. It's terribly, terribly destructive and wicked. So that's his rationale for destroying Desdemona. But what about wanting to destroy Cassio? Well, from what he says, his dislike for Cassio begins with Cassio, somebody he describes as being an outsider, an arithmetician, and not a soldier, getting the position that Iago himself wants. By his own admission, that's envy. He wants what Cassio has, and he's upset that Cassio got what he wanted. But it's also a strange form of envy, because Iago doesn't celebrate getting Cassio's position at all. In fact, apart from the first scene of the first act, Iago never brings up the idea that he wants the position of lieutenant ever again. And that's strange for somebody who not only gets Cassio fired, but then also becomes lieutenant. There's no celebration there. There's no hint of satisfaction at getting what he got. In fact, he seems totally uninterested. So that calls into question his ambition as a motive, especially for what he does to Cassio. It's almost as though these are rationalizations for doing what he wants to do. And I say that because at the end of the play, Act 5, Scene 1, line 19, he says that Cassio hath a daily beauty about his life that makes me ugly. And that, I think, is telling. I think that's when the mask completely comes off Iago. Cassio seems to have a good life. It's not about the position. It's not about Iago getting things. It's about other people having a good life and him being envious of the good life, the good looks, the status, the whatever else that it is. And it's not about himself having them. It's about nobody else having those things. That seems to be the core of it. That seems to be what he admits to. I think that's what's really going on with Iago. Iago himself is captured by something. He's possessed by the spirit of envy. And it's not about position. It's not about his wife apparently being unfaithful with Othello and also Cassio. He says that he thinks Cassio's slept with his wife as well. But these really seem to be rationalizations that he puts on top of his core envy and him being upset that Cassio has just got this wonderful life. To answer the question, does Iago believe that Cassio and Othello has slept with his wife? Obviously, we can't know for certain, but it's quite reasonable to say that Iago might be doing what we all do, which is to come up for reasons to explain what we have done or what we want to do in a sort of post hoc manner. I think we have to stick with that comment that Iago makes about Cassio having a daily beauty about his life that makes him ugly. There's a deep visceral loathing that exists there, and it's not just that he envies Cassio. He then decides that he wants to destroy Cassio simply because he has it better than himself. That's an unbelievably malevolent impulse, and it reveals something particularly telling about the nature and danger of envy. And that is that if envy is left unchecked, it ends up corrupting you to an almost miraculous degree. I mean, if you think about it, what does Iago actually get from Cassio's destruction and death? The quote I mentioned is literally Iago's rationale for wanting him to die. He is so upset that Cassio's life appears so good, that he has so many blessings, from his good looks and high birth to the fact that he once got a position that Iago wanted, that he simply wants his destruction, even though that doesn't achieve anything materially for Iago's own prospects. Cassio dying, sure, maybe he gets the promotion, but getting rid of Cassio doesn't change that he doesn't have the things that Cassio has. So that envy is so deep and so depraved that he simply wants the destruction of the other because he doesn't have it. can't accept that somebody else has something that is good. And that's what is at the bottom of envy and hatred. It's the desire for the destruction or marring of the other. That's at the core of evil, like I've tried to establish already. It's a hallmark of evil, a core feature of it. It's that desire to twist or destroy something else, not because it is bad, but because it is good. And so I would say that envy is positioned here as a conduit to that core impulse of evil. Let's turn our attention to poor old Rodrigo. What is Iago's motive behind his actions against Rodrigo? Well, it's basically that Iago, I think he says it to Rodrigo, and then he says it to us, the audience. He sees Rodrigo as a sucker he can exploit for money. And there's clear evidence in that he milks Rodrigo for every cent he possesses. But there's a bit more to it than that. It's not just that he can get something out of Rodrigo. There seems to be a genuine pleasure that Iago takes out of manipulating and using Rodrigo. In Act 1, Scene 3 in line 374, he convinces Rodrigo to keep pursuing Desdemona, and as a result to keep paying him. And Iago chuckles to himself, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse," before continuing to say that Rodrigo would be a complete waste of his time if he didn't provide Iago with sport and profit. So in other words, he enjoys using and abusing Rodrigo, and I would argue that this extends to a lot of his misdeeds. He seems to enjoy the game. He enjoys messing around with others and causing them pain, causing chaos to exist in their lives. Again, this seems to be a key aspect of the nature of evil. It's not just about wanting to harm others. It takes delight in it. It enjoys the process of it. There's enjoyment to be had in ruining or destroying or harming another person. Or it doesn't have to be a person. It could be an animal or a landscape or a building or whatever, or a work of art. There's this impish enjoyment that comes out of destroying something that is good or beautiful or true. That is evil. It's more than immorality. And it's a sobering reminder of what is out there and the point that a person can get to when they follow the wrong path. I don't have time to go into everything, but I do think if you take a lot of Shakespeare's great tragedies, one of the core ideas that he's wrestling with is the concept and nature of evil. And you put them together and you get various aspects of it. In Othello, we get somebody at the end point of that process. We get somebody who has gone so far down the line that there's not even a possibility of him entertaining not doing something that is evil. And that's evidence, I would suggest, that what Shakespeare is presenting here is not just that Iago is somebody who slipped into following the path of evil and wickedness because he felt down by Othello. It suggests to me that this was a path Iago had already chosen in other ways, and when this set of circumstances came about, well, this was the path that he was always going to choose. It's suggestive that one can choose that path deliberately themselves. Iago is not tricked by a trio of witches here. Iago makes this decision himself, it seems to me. He's opened himself up to that line by himself. This is human depravity and human wickedness and evil that's on show. And it's a sobering reminder that there are people like this, but also it's a sobering reminder that anyone can do this. And once you go too far, you get to the point of no return because you have gone beyond right and wrong and agonizing over right and wrong. You get to the point where you take delight in using and abusing other people. And that brings me on to the first question that I mentioned. I mean, in the short term, Iago seems to be doing all sorts of things. Iago seems to be doing all of this out of envy, jealousy, a desire to destroy what he cannot have, as well as the simple enjoyment of destroying others. But you have to ask, what does Iago achieve in the long term? And honestly, I can't find anything towards which Iago's ultimately aiming. There doesn't seem to be anything beyond the immediate desire to destroy Othello and then Cassio and Desdemona as part of this and enjoying using Rodrigo and getting money out of him. Again, he seems to have no ambition, since he forgets all about wanting to climb the ranks or anything like that. And he might say he just follows people to serve his own ends, but what are those ends? Ultimately, what is he trying to achieve? There is no grand vision directing his life. It seems like his aim, if you can call it that, is simply to do the maximal amount of damage possible and cause chaos and suffering for those around him in the short term. Chaos, by the way, is another aspect of evil. That's why in Genesis you have the chaos waters that God brings to order. Chaos is an aspect of evil. And so there doesn't seem to be a grand strategy here. It's just simply the almost instinctive reaction to use his intellect and circumstances and opportunities to cause chaos and damage, because he's malevolently opposed to the world and to life as embodied by the people around him. So for all of his wit and intelligence, his life is directed to something remarkably small-minded. And it reduces him to somebody being trapped by his own resentment and loathing of others. I would go so far as to say that the evil path upon which he has confined himself limits him in his opportunities and prevents him from looking at a larger picture or at the hope for the future, or any hope for the future. And so he becomes consumed more and more by the desire to harm and destroy that which is good around him. That's what envy does to a person. But more than that, that's what happens when you give yourself over to the path of evil. As much as it harms others, it shrinks your world and harms you yourself. This is something that Christopher Marlowe and Dr. Faustus explores. Dr. Faustus sells his soul to the devil to get power, and he gets given his personal demon. But what ends up happening is his soul is sold to the devil, and all of that means that he's trapped. Actually, his life is limited. The power that he has access to is constrained to a smaller and smaller sphere of influence, to the point where he basically becomes a magician who does some magic tricks like a court jester. He doesn't get anything out of it. And that's kind of what happens to Iago. His world is shrunk and limited to his immediate surrounds. There are no grand horizons that choosing this path opens him to. If anything, it forces him to be more and more consumed by the immediate future and his immediate surrounds, because he's just trying to stay out of trouble and stay ahead of getting caught until that itself runs out, as his world increasingly contracts to the point where he's clapped in irons and presumably is going to be killed. So this is another aspect of evil. It's not on your side, and as much as it causes chaos and suffering around the person who embraces it, it also causes tremendous suffering and chaos for the person who embraces it. That's what Iago discovers too late. Look, this doesn't exhaust a study of Iago, the character, or a character study of Iago. You could have a look at a whole bunch of the interactions he has with other people. We haven't really touched on specific passages that deal with his interactions with Othello. You could have a look at that. But I think what we've done is explore a fairly broad and yet kind of deep dive into Iago's character. He is sort of the personification or embodiment of evil here. He is somebody who has gone so far along the path that he becomes synonymous with evil, and so he opens up the nature of evil for us, the audience, to see. That seems to be what Shakespeare is doing here. Now, this is not Shakespeare trying to preach to you or anything. He is exploring what he has seen and experienced, I think. And so in the person of Iago, we see somebody who is totally consumed by evil, and we see that this causes a great deal of suffering and chaos for those around him and for him himself. And a key idea that I've tried to draw out from all of this is that this is a warning both to you that you don't want to end up like that, but also that there are people around us who are predatory like that, and you've got to be careful. You need to be aware of it. And Shakespeare does this masterfully through telling a story. And that's because, again, Shakespeare is just exploring the world around him. So in the fascinating character of Iago, we have a lot of complexity. We have truth examined. We have the nature of evil examined. We have human interactions held up to the light. And it's very useful for us because it helps us to make sense of the world around us. And I think that's the utility of Shakespeare. That's one of the aspects that makes Shakespeare so useful and so valuable. There's a great deal of insight as Shakespeare reflects reality through a narrative, through a drama that unfolds the world around us into a very identifiable story. We can inhabit and live and experience through. That is enough for today. Thank you very much to you for listening. I hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers for now.